connection. And it was through a connection in writing that I discovered that Laurie was currently writing a book on the topic of MAID. Laurie's husband opted to die by MAID in March 2021. And when we were talking about it, I thought that would be a wonderful topic for us to have here. I won't tell you any more than that because Laurie's here and she's going to introduce the topic. So Laurie, thank you.
Oh, yes, thank you all for coming, especially with the weather. So I'm going to start by saying that my talk today on MAID will be very personal because I'm not a doctor and I'm not a lawyer. I'm merely a writer and a retired English teacher. So I may be able to answer some of your questions on the ins and outs of the procedures for MAID, but that's not going to be the focus of this talk. This is my story, mine and my family's, and how MAID, something we had never heard of before 2021, came to define it. It's meant to be a window into one family's experience, and every family experiences their MAID journey in a very different way. And I would suggest for a bigger window into these journeys, I would strongly recommend Dr. Stephanie Green's book, So This is Assisted Dying. So I will start my talk on MAID by saying that MAID saved my husband's life, and possibly my own. And I know this may sound ironic or like hyperbole or like something I'm opening my talk with for dramatic effect, but it's not. It is a simple and true statement. For several years before Ron's death by MAID in July of 2022, his daily life was a struggle. This struggle increased in intensity with each passing month. And without MAID, it's really impossible to imagine where this struggle would have taken him. He himself was full of fears for his future because he felt he had reached the threshold of how much pain he could endure. And no drugs other than cannabis and later opioids were giving him temporary relief. So in a blog post for Dying with Dignity Canada, I believe we have here, this one here, follow along. Dying with Dignity Canada, Ron described living with this type of pain. I've been living in a black hole for quite a few years now. This black hole is a place that no one ever wants to visit. And once you end up getting there, getting out again is simply not possible. It's a place no one else can really see into, but which encompasses your whole being and encases you in a special darkness which separates you from the world and the ones you love. Chronic pain does that over time, slowly trapping you in your own body and diminishing your basic existence until little is left but the pain and managing the pain as best you can. I've been living with chronic pain for almost half a century, which is way too long. And so it has come to the point now where the pain must end, and so it will soon. I'll go back here. For myself, as his primary contact and caregiver, his disease had put me in a kind of prison as well. As any caretaker knows, the disease your person has becomes part of you. It infuses every part of your life with worry, with guilt, with anger, and with a sense of dread that the situation will either get worse or end with a loss, and neither option is appealing. So Ron had 3 chronic illnesses. The main disease was ankylosing spondylitis, an autoimmune arthritic disease that causes inflammation and fusion of the spine. And he was first diagnosed with it before we met in his early 20s. And then he lived with varying degrees of back pain throughout the decades. And then when he hit 50, the ankylosing spondylitis seemed to flare up like a sleeping dragon when he hit 50, as I said. So about 5 years before his death, he was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, hence more pain. And next, some of the biologics that he was prescribed for the AS gave him a terrible case of IBS. And as he himself described the situation, I'm not sure if I have, oh yeah, this one here. He said, aside from managing daily severe chronic pain, my ability to walk, eat, sleep, defecate, and urinate have all become affected and are frequently very difficult. I have no real quality of life to speak of, and basic life functions are barely manageable. So Ron was able to access MAID because of a change to Bill C-14, which was the original MAID bill, which came into effect in Canada in 2016. And at that time, one's death had to be reasonably foreseeable. And this basically limited MAID to those with terminal illnesses. And while Ron's suffering was immense, his natural death was not foreseeable. In theory, his suffering might have gone on for years. So he followed the debates on MAID very closely. And when Bill C-7 came into effect in March of 2021, he pounced. He hoped he could qualify for the new Track 2 MAID, which was for people whose natural deaths were not reasonably foreseeable and who could prove they had done everything possible to find a cure. So Ron did all this privately, not wanting to alarm his family. However, one day in the fall of 2021, I was standing behind him when he opened the mailbox and retrieved a big brown envelope. And I caught sight of the return address in the corner, and it said Dying with Dignity, Canada. And this was my first clue that he was thinking in that direction. Don't worry, he said at the time, I'm just gathering information, but it niggled. And once you've seen something like that, it's very hard to forget. So eventually I would learn that Ron fit all the requirements for Track 2 MAID. First, he held a valid Canadian health card. Second, he was over 18 and still had decision-making capacities. Third, he had at least one grievous and irremediable condition. Fourth, his request for MAID would come from him alone without any outside pressure, and at least for the moment, he would be able to give consent. Finally, he would consent to MAID being fully aware of all the known treatments for the illnesses he had and for other methods to relieve his suffering. So one of the concerns for people accessing Track 2 MAID is that advance consent is not yet legal in Canada. For Track 1 candidates, or for people whose deaths are foreseeable, there is now something called Audrey's Amendment, which allows people to waive final consent ahead of time, just in case the person is incapacitated on the day. And the amendment is actually named for a Nova Scotia woman named Audrey Parker, who was forced to access MAID much earlier than she would have liked because she was afraid that she would be lose capacity and not be able to consent at the time of the MAID procedure, which is required by law. I believe she'd been hoping to have one more Christmas, and if she were to, go through this now, she would have had that wish. So knowing this, Ron was really anxious to get the ball rolling. I mean, his memory was getting worse with each passing month, I think due to all the drugs he was taking and also stress. And plus he feared that he would have a stroke and that would impair his ability to give consent on the day. And his fear that anything at all would impede his ability to access MAID was strong. The process to MAID, however, was anything but smooth, as none of Ron's doctors in Montreal wanted to support his application, and this is the first step. These doctors included his GP, his rheumatologist, and his pain doctor. The rejections delayed the MAID provision by about 6 months. We never really understood the doctors' refusals, and they never explained. And we wondered, were there objections based on ethics, religion, discomfort, a sense of failure at not having helped him, or fear of reprisals? We simply never knew. All we knew was that these doctors had not been able to help Ron live a better life, and now they were denying him a better death. And their refusals added immensely to his strength. So the Hippocratic Oath, of course, is the document most often referred to in discussions around MAID, in particular the promise to do no harm. And for me, this raises the question of what is harm? And the cruel triptych of diseases that Ron had was already causing him plenty of harm. And the release from the pain and suffering would be the opposite of harm. And as far as my research showed me, the Hippocratic Oath also calls for free medical tuition and sometimes prohibits doctors from using the knife, promises that are easily discarded. Furthermore, one interpretation of the original oath also includes the words, "and injustice after do no harm." What is justice when it comes to someone's own decision to carry on suffering or to end their life? Who gets to mete out this justice? Ron's 3 doctors became judge and jury to his illness and suffering, handing down a life sentence of pain. His GP, who refused to believe that Ron had ankylosing spondylitis for about 20 years, had initially promised to support him, but in the final instance refused to sign the papers. Finally, he said he would consider supporting him if Ron agreed to be seen at the McGill University Pain Clinic. So we called the clinic, and there was a 1 to 1.5 year wait list. And for someone like Ron, you know, that's an eternity. His actual pain doctor, who merely prescribed more drugs, advised him first to read a book called Eat Dirt. We heard another 4-letter word ending in T. But we got the book, and it basically touted an anti-inflammatory diet that Ron was already more or less following, apart from eating massive amounts of bone broth. So we tried that too. We bought some, we made some, friends made us some. We were swimming in bone broth, no change. So eventually Ron lodged a complaint with our local CIU-SSS, a French acronym that basically stands for an Integrated University Health and Social Services Center. However, they were without a MAID coordinator, and it would be 3 months before they hired one, which also delayed the provision. So eventually in March of 2022, 2 nurses were sent over to help Ron fill in the application, which is the first step. And then this was followed by the requisite 2 doctors' visits and assessments. Both were palliative care doctors, and they were very sympathetic to Ron's story. They had read his file, and they had seen how much effort he had put into finding remedies for his pain. They could see that he had tried several types of biologics, NSAIDs, acupuncture, photobiomodulation therapy, all to no effect. His main release came from cannabis and the many in-house massages he had with the woman we eventually nicknamed Saving Grace. So after a 1-hour interview, the first doctor, a diminutive man with a friendly face that we could only partially see due to his COVID mask and visor, said he thought that Ron definitely qualified for Track 2 MAID. I admit this surprised me, perhaps because of all the doctors' refusals, but also because with Track 2 there is more subjectivity. Ron had to convince the doctor of his pain and daily suffering, and I wasn't sure he could. He tended to always downplay things. And since that day, I've learned that it is the person seeking MAID who gets to decide when the suffering has become intolerable, not the doctor or the nurse practitioner, as the case may be. And a key phrase in the law is that the suffering cannot be relieved under conditions that you consider acceptable, you being the person who's sick. So this really respects the person who is ill and puts control and power into their hands. And those are the 2 things that the illness has often robbed them of. So the young doctor then explained that the 90-day wait period, which is essential only for Track 2 candidates, not for Track 1, would start that day. And this also stunned me. I didn't think things would happen this quickly, and I wasn't really sure I wanted them to, although I knew that Ron did. When the doctor asked how I felt about everything, I could barely speak, but it was nice to be asked. As Ron's primary caregiver, my feelings were not often solicited. Caregivers can be overlooked. We learn that our needs come second. We learn that our hardships are not as important as those of the person that we're caring for. And the fact that this doctor was interested in how this was affecting me brought me to tears. It was like he had given me permission to pull off the mask. The second doctor, who was also very compassionate, came 2 weeks later and confirmed the diagnosis. This was now real. I had never before been in a situation where I was rooting for something to happen and dreading it in very equal measure, and I couldn't decide which side I fell on. I was on both at the same time. Going through this process was extremely stressful, sad, hopeful, and much of the time surreal. We had filled out many applications in our 35 years together, but never one to end Ron's life. We'd had plans for our future, for our retirement together, and these included all the typical things that middle-class couples look forward to: downsizing, travel, leisure time to read and wander, watching our family grow and thrive. We were both writers. We had met in a creative writing class at Concordia University, but I had devoted much more of my writing career to writing than Ron had, and he always talked about getting back to writing in his retirement. But his forced retirement in 2015 landed him in a very different landscape. The pain levels had made teaching simply impossible, so he was forced to retire early. And travel was too difficult because of the physical pain and his difficulties walking. By the end, he was walking with 2 canes. And writing was impossible for him because of the constant chronic fatigue. And Ron's whole day became centered on one thing: pain management. It was a full-time job from the time he got out of bed in the morning to the time he went to bed, and sometimes also all through the night, when he would wake frequently to take more cannabis to be able to sleep. Pain was his constant companion, riding shotgun. The effect of all this, of course, was that it greatly changed our relationship. I had joked to a friend that Ron's disease was his mistress. He had to consult it before consenting to any plan with me, and it was never out of his mind. And he gave it far more attention than he gave me. Any of you who have been caretakers will know that what happens is you put your own needs and desires aside. You learn that they're not going to be met, and the disappointment simply becomes too hard to take. So you concentrate on giving and shed any expectation of receiving. Ron was aware that living with him had become very difficult, and he felt very bad about this. It added greatly to his mental anguish. He knew that he wasn't the same husband to me anymore. He wasn't the same father to our 3 daughters, and he wasn't the same grandpa to our 3 grandchildren. So we were living in an atmosphere of pain and disappointment. There seemed to be no way out. So when Bill C7 came along, Ron saw this as a solution to a way of life that had been zapped of all pleasure. In April, we told our 3 daughters and 3 grandchildren that Ron had chosen to end his life with MAID. We did our daughters first, ours together and his 2 from before we met. They were not entirely surprised, but they were distraught nonetheless. Ron had an amazing relationship with his girls. They did a lot of things together. They traveled, they went to movies, long walks and talks about life and the state of the world. They would be losing a central figure in their lives. Many tears flowed the night we told them, but somehow the moment of confession also brought us closer together. The rest of the world vanished, and we closed ranks, narrowing our focus to him and him alone, determined to make the best of his time and the rest of his time as meaningful as possible. I carry an image of the 4 of them on the big couch, Ron in the middle, his arms around them, the 3 girls turned toward him, legs tucked up as though they were trying to meld together. I think that's that picture. Lots of forced smiles, I think, in that one. We told the grandchildren a week later, which was more brutal. We don't often talk about death and dying in our culture, especially to children, and we don't have the words or the comfort level to do so effectively. So Ron impressed me so much that day with the way he explained his decision to them, starting with giving them an overview of the suffering he was experiencing. They knew some of this already. He had stopped being able to do anything with them. He used to take them to movies, to the pool, for lunch, for driving practice, but all that had come to an end about 4 years earlier. Now he could barely manage a 1-hour visit with them without tiring. He wasn't their funny old grandpa anymore. And it seemed eons ago that he was monster grandpa, throwing a sheet over his head and chasing them around the house, his large hands spread out like talons. Then he clearly explained what MAID was and how it would happen. They were 14, 17, at 20 at the time. They weren't little kids, so they understood what death was, and they knew what he was describing. Many tears flowed that night, and I think they left someone in shock. The middle boy, who seemed the most stoic at the time, apparently broke down the minute they hit the elevator. MAID affects every member of the family profoundly, and at least in our case, there was zero follow-up support. We had to lean solely on each other and what support we could find on our own. The system provided none, although the first doctor did say that he was always available to answer any of our family questions. My eldest stepdaughter, the kid's mother, resorted to online therapy because she simply could not find a therapist taking new patients post-COVID. No services were offered to us by the CIS. They never checked in or followed up. We were set adrift by the very troubled healthcare system in Quebec. I have the impression that Nova Scotia does a better job of providing support, as I've met two social workers now who work on the MAID team, and their sole job is to support families going through MAID. So I hope that's the case. So sometime in June, Ron chose July 11th for the provision. He had to do it early in July or wait until the end of August when the doctor would be back from vacation. And he was eager now. And he knew the wait would be difficult for all of us. So the longer the wait, the more difficult it would be. For the date, he had to take various family birth dates into consideration because he didn't want them marred by association. And this wasn't easy because we have a lot of birthdays in our family in the summer. But it was important to allow him to choose the date without any input from the rest of us. He had to be completely in charge of everything to do with the MAID provision. He had lost so much control of his life through the disease that controlling the death would be the last empowering act of his life. So July 11th it was. Knowing the exact date of a loved one's death is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it allows you to prepare and do all the things and say all the things you need to before the person dies. And it is a curse because it is exceptionally hard to know on that precise date and time your loved one will be gone. The date repeats like a mantra in your mind to the backdrop of a ticking clock. For those months leading up to his provision, we lived in a MAID bubble. All of our thoughts and energies centered on what was to come and on making Ron's life as full and special as possible up to this day, and on making sure all the words we wanted to speak were spoken. The word last took on a new meaning. I wrote an article called The Last Soup for Dying with Dignity Canada, and they called to ask if Ron and I would be interviewed for their website. Track 2 was still very new and not many people had accessed it at that point. The simple act of making soup, which was the only food Ron could eat towards the end without choking on, and which sat well in his messed up stomach, became invested with extra meaning. So did every episode of The X-Files rewatched with his youngest daughter, political debates with the middle one, and visits with his eldest and her 3 children. So I'm going to leave you hanging there for a while and maybe we'll take our break. Is it a good time? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
One, two, three. Good. I can hear. Okay, welcome back to part 2. And just for those people that are those 60 to 70 people who are watching this Zoom presentation at home, if you have questions, any questions at all, please type them in as you would normally do that, and we will read your question here and get the appropriate answer for you. And turn it back to our
Thank you.
speaker. Thanks.
All right, so I'll continue with my story, and I think you might find this next part a little bit surprising. But on May 11th, 2022, after 35 years together, Ron and I got married. Thank you. It was a short, simple, and I have to say surreal ceremony. We had sold our family home a few years earlier because Ron could no longer do stairs, and our old cottage in Valois, as charming as it was, had only one bathroom. With his ever-increasing IBS, this was becoming a big problem. We solved the problem unconventionally by selling our home and getting 2 apartments in the same building in Dorval along the banks of Lac Saint-Louis, units 602 and 502. I was on top. For the whole relationship. So for 3 years, we were neighbors and would joke about the old 70s pop hit, knock 3 times on the ceiling if you want me, twice on the pipes if the answer is no. We would visit as much as his pain levels allowed, carry meals up and down the stairwell, and wave from our balconies. And I came to love the metallic sound of his cane tapping on the granite stairs, signifying that he was still here. The privacy of his own place allowed him to suffer and do bodily functions with more dignity. It allowed me to feel that his illness wasn't dominating my life, or at least it wasn't right on top of me. I couldn't hear his moans and groans and the deep breathing and loud exhaling he did to control his pain, sounds that had begun to drive me crazy when we were living together in the same house. The living arrangement, however, would cause me problems down the line with the Quebec government. Since our marriage took place less than a year before our death, I was investigated. And in spite of submitting a dozen documents proving we had been a couple for 35 years, as well as witness testimonies, the 2 separate addresses, the 502 and 602, raised alarms for them. And they treated me very much like a gold digger who had only married Ron when I knew he was dying, which was extremely hurtful. And as I told them many times, if I were a gold digger, I would have chosen a much better victim. It would take 10 months for me to convince them otherwise. And I was only able to do so after I tracked down the doctor who had performed the provision, and that was not easy. And he agreed to call Revenue Quebec on my behalf to say that when we married in May, Ron had not yet chosen his date for MAID. That meant I did not technically know that he was going to die when we got married. I mean, where is Kafka when you need him? My stepdaughter and her wife and 1 close friend were the only guests at our wedding. It was a marriage of future convenience. In the research I had done, I knew the bureaucratic road that lay ahead would be smoother if we had that piece of paper to show. I met alone with the notary because Ron really wasn't leaving the house much at that point, and told her that the vows should be simple and not contain the words "till death do you part," and that there would be no rings. I focused on the ugly greenish beige color of her walls. And they reminded me of the thick pantyhose my Oma used to wear to stay grounded while she discreetly pushed a box of tissue in my direction. Honestly, that day is a blur. I remember trying not to cry, but hearing my stepdaughter cry in the background. I remember the notary treating Ron like he was a mentally disabled 10-year-old and wanting to punch her in the face. I remember feeling abandoned when the 3 guests all went outside on the balcony to smoke, and I was left alone, staring at the gluten-free cake we still had to cut. In the end, it became part and parcel of a series of surreal events that spring and summer. Over the month of June, many family members, as well as Ron's closest friend, who lives in northern Saskatchewan, came to say goodbye. Each goodbye took a chunk out of him, and there weren't many chunks left. He had grown so thin. You can see the difference the 10 years made there. He had a private and separate visit with each one of the grandchildren to say goodbye. He gave each a memory box he'd put together specifically for them, photos and objects from his life, badges and coins and stones and collectibles. I can't even imagine the toll it took on him to walk each grandchild to the door and say the final goodbye. I caught the tail end of his visit with our granddaughter. She had made a veil of her long blonde hair and was crying into his chest. When she and her mom left, Ron fell asleep in his recliner, the pain etched in his face. No one chooses MAID lightly. To voluntarily put yourself and your family members through so many painful moments means you feel you have no alternative. You're at the end of what you can endure. In his blog, Ron would write that nobody can prepare you for how difficult it is to say goodbye to the people you love. Yes, we all understood and supported Ron's desire for MAID. Watching him suffer had been horrible. Watching his body waste away had been hard. And watching his life diminish and lose its luster had been heartbreaking. We were grateful for this means of ending his suffering. But to this day, we are amazed that we were able to face that day, July 11th, with so much stoicism and grace. We talk about it whenever we're all together, like we were a few months ago at my daughter's wedding in Cole Harbor. It was a home wedding, and we placed the urn with Ron's ashes in the living room so he could be there. How, we all say, did we get through that day? I know that many things that human beings have survived defy logic and imagination, and that things way harder and more gruesome than a MAID death have been overcome. Still, looking back on that day, it is really hard for us to fathom. We each had a private goodbye with Ron at some point on July 11th. Each daughter had her half hour down the hall in the bedroom where Ron lay waiting, the ports in his arms, and their faces told a story when they emerged. I had my time as well, but it's the one thing I can't talk about in public for fear of collapse. Suffice it to say that it had been a while since I laid my head on Ron's shoulder, and what struck me most was how bony it had become. It wasn't the shoulder I was used to. This MAID procedure was not premature. It was an hour full of love and tenderness, and one that is etched forever in my mind. I can write about it, but I cannot talk about it. So you'll just have to read my memoir if I ever finish it. A nurse had come in midday to put the ports in Ron's arms while I rubbed his feet. She had difficulty finding a vein. It's like his body was fighting the process. I thought about the word port, the French word for door. It was fitting. She was fitting him with a portal to another world. At 5:30, another nurse arrived to flush the ports and make sure the entry to this other world was clear. Then the doctor arrived at 6 p.m. on the dot to perform the MAID procedure. Every bone in my body wanted not to be moving towards that door to let him in, but I did. How Ron's 3 daughters and I managed to follow the doctor to the bedroom is beyond me. He carried a hard black briefcase that floated down the hall like a raven, its intention clear. It contained both dread and relief, the magic potion that would end Ron's life and suffering. We surrounded him on the queen-size bed, 3 of us on one side, 1 at his feet, all of us clutching hands, our knuckles white. Wherever Ron looked, he would see us. The doctor and nurse occupied the far side. As required by law, the doctor asked Ron for verbal confirmation that he wanted to proceed, and he said yes. When the doctor asked if we were all ready, we lied and said yes too. How can one ever be ready for a moment like this? But Ron was ready. He nodded, and we all told him we loved him. Then he looked around the room and quipped, "I've always wanted 4 beautiful women in my bed." It lightened the moment and infused the atmosphere with his essence and his wit, but I'm not sure it helped because it reinforced so much what we would miss. The needles were way bigger than I expected. No one had given us any warning. They looked more like vials, and there were many. I wish I'd been more prepared for that. When the first one goes in, the person goes way under. We watched Ron's eyes close and a peaceful countenance spread over his face, more peaceful than we'd seen in ages. The others were harder to watch, as their purpose is to stop the person's heart from beating. After several injections, I lost count. The doctor checked and said he could detect a faint heartbeat, so he prepared another shot. Our daughter could no longer watch, so she left. We had discussed this beforehand, how there would be no shame or judgment if anybody had to leave the room at any time. The rest of us stayed right to the end. When the doctor declared him officially dead, I left to find my daughter to make sure she was okay. She was standing at the balcony door, looking up over the lake. There, the hawk that Ron loved to see was circling overhead. "It is him," we both said in unison. We loved the thought that the bird, which had delighted Ron, was somehow lifting his spirit into the air. The hours following the death were surreal and appeared to me as a blur of images. Signing papers, being handed papers to send along to the funeral home, the long wait for the van to arrive, someone bringing me soup and then a glass of wine, maybe two. Going down the hallway to check that he was in fact dead and hadn't started to breathe again. Ron's youngest brother showing up to see the body. One of the girls had found him distraught, pacing outside our building. One attendant asking me permission to put a tag on Ron's toe. The other assuring me that he'd treat Ron as though he were his own mother. Trying not to look as they wheeled him out under heavy black plastic. And then the two men turning to us in the dark under the moon and bowing before they shut the back door of the van. The following week, we cleared out Ron's apartment. I was on practical pilot mode. The lease was up soon, and it had to be done, along with commencing the paperwork and arranging the memorial. I didn't break down much, or maybe I did and just don't remember. It was just weird for all of us as we did the work together, almost silently. Our two grandsons took some of Ron's clothes and electronics. Each daughter chose a plaid shirt that they would wear knotted at the waist over their dresses at the memorial. Much went to Renaissance Quebec's Goodwill, and I claimed the Lazy Boy, the large leather chair Ron had basically lived in for years. It was all I wanted. I wanted to sit where he had sat, its padded shape molded to his body. That and his battered copies of Samuel Delaney's books, including Dahlgren, the first book he had ever lent me about 35 years earlier. Two men from the second floor, both refugees from Colombia, came to claim some of the furniture, including the dining room table that had been our family table for 25 years. That was when my daughter and I had our collapse. The men stopped at the door and waited until we were okay to proceed. It was clear they'd had their own painful goodbyes. They carried off the table that bore evidence of hundreds of birthdays and holiday celebrations. A lifetime of family life was etched into its wood, but it was a time of letting go. Other odd things would make me break down in the following weeks, standing in the gluten-free aisle where I would normally text Ron to see what he needed, men's departments in stores, the plaid shirts that were his signature slapping me in the face. All these things told me that he had done it. He had really done it. He'd had MAID. As many of you know, it is when the activity around death and the funerals or memorials die down and everyone has gone home that the grief really kicks in. One stepdaughter returned to the States, my own daughter returned to Nova Scotia, and the friend that had been with me through it all went back to her home in Toronto. The euphoria of the beautiful memorial and all the kind words about Ron from family, friends, and colleagues had lifted me up and carried me through the week, but that too was now fading. None of my Weber relatives live in Montreal anymore, so they had all gone home, and I was now completely alone in the building. The empty apartment below me was like a chasm. It was like the bottomless pit we had seen years earlier in the Carlsbad Caverns, and I felt I would fall into it. When I heard noise down there, meaning the caretaker was showing it to prospective renters, I wanted to scream. They were invading sacred space, and I knew that I had to leave. My many good friends helped me through. One dropped everything and came to stay with me for a few nights when I was at my lowest. Others would come to help me pack and get ready for my move east. How anyone gets through life without close friends is beyond me. Another resource that helped me get through the entire MAID process was Bridge C14, an online organization that offers free workshops for those facing MAID, for those supporting somebody facing MAID, and for those grieving a loss by MAID. My daughters and I had attended many of their sessions leading up to Ron's provision, sharing our sorrows and fears, and it was immensely helpful to hear other people share their own. We were suddenly not alone. Their 10-week grief session changed my life. It started the night after Ron's death, so I was raw, but that night I met 4 women from across the country who have become my grief sisters. We have continued to meet weekly, long after the 10 weeks were over, and I think we'll do so for many years to come. I wrote about them in an article published in the Globe and Mail. It opened with the sentence, "I have never met them in person, but I love them all, my grief sisters." Our MAID struggles were the same, but different. Our responses to the grief varied and identical all at once. The best thing was that we listened to each other's stories without judgment and checked in with each other through the week. I wrote that the process was like building houses made of memory, of trauma, but also of love. When I moved to Dartmouth to be close to my daughter, just months after Ron's death, I felt very alone. I'd had Ron's blessing to come here. He liked the thought that I would be with our daughter, and I was able to show him the floor plans and artist renderings for my apartment. It felt odd showing him a glimpse into a future that he wouldn't be part of. But as odd as this sounds, I liked that he would know where to find me. In those early days, it was my grief sisters who helped me through. I recall one night early on when I looked down on the city from my new 10th floor apartment, and I watched the lights twinkle on the houses up the hill and the red taillights along the highway, and I thought how I didn't know a single soul behind any of the lights, and I felt so alone. So I wrote my grief sisters, and they wrote back immediately through our chat group. They reminded me that I was not alone. They were with me. As I stated in my piece, they understand the struggle to rebuild, to redefine, and to feel solid again, and the lights took on a different hue. This type of support specific to MAID is vital to recovery, because MAID is a very specific type of death. It is an appointment with death. I believe my daughters and I all carry a bit of trauma from watching the vials go into the ports that night. There was trauma in watching him die, but there had been trauma in watching him suffer too. But we are recovering slowly, and we are incredibly grateful that Ron was able to find relief from the daily suffering and pain that he endured for as long as he possibly could. I listened to an interview with Dr. Stephanie Green on BBC Radio one morning, and the interviewer asked her if she was ashamed that Canada had such a high number of deaths by assisted suicide, as the host kept insisting on calling it. She answered very calmly and said that she was proud, not ashamed, that we have a humane law that helps people end their suffering. I'm paraphrasing, but she said something along those lines, and I was really glad, and then angry. Why should we feel shame that we decide to take control of our own lives and destiny and choose to die when we've had enough suffering? Ron knew that people might oppose MAID, so he was guarded in who he told. His colleagues only found out at his memorial. He said once that he worried about fanatics targeting us once he was gone, especially with the wide reach of social media. None of us ever posted anything about MAID and what our family was going through, and we only told our closest people. I'm not sure if he had just become a bit paranoid or if this concern was legitimate. In any case, we never encountered any issues. Last spring, I was interviewed for an Al Jazeera podcast called The Take, along with 3 other Canadians about Bill C7. The moderator, herself a longtime sufferer from rheumatoid arthritis, was very respectful in her questions. But when the podcast came out, it was called The Expansion of Assisted Suicide in Canada. This upset me, and Ron would never have called his provision suicide, nor would I. It has an entirely different tone and connotation. So I wrote the producer and pointed out that here in Canada, we call it assisted dying, and she apologized. In November, I sat on a wonderful panel about MAID organized by Good Grief Nova Scotia, now called Grief Matters. We were an academic from Ottawa who collects stories around death, a counselor who specializes in children and death, and myself. At the end, a member of the audience, which was comprised of healthcare professionals, grief counselors, social workers, asked why we teach children to cope with suffering, but allow adults to take the easy way out through MAID. Other panelists fielded the question while I sat stunned. Easy way out? I wanted to shout at her. Nothing, and I mean nothing, about what Ron and our family went through that summer can be categorized as easy. I screamed my response to her in my head for many nights after that day, kicking myself for not speaking up. I simply couldn't because I was afraid I'd be foul-mouthed, and the swanky ballroom at the Westin Hotel didn't seem like the right venue. 11 countries now allow some form of medically assisted death, even though it varies greatly from country to country, and many others like the UK, Germany, and France are in the process of discussing its implementation. The earliest country to adopt it was Switzerland, and the most recent was Australia in 2022. 11 states in the USA allow it, but it's only for terminally ill people who are 6 months away from certain death. And they have to be able to hold and drink the elixir themselves. A doctor is not allowed to administer it. Austria, Belgium, Canada, Colombia, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Spain do also have a similar Track 2 allowance, but most countries where assisted dying is legal, it's only for terminally ill people. So Ron would not have qualified, nor in the States. Canada has tabled legislation to include mental illness until this year, which has proven to be controversial, and it should be interesting to see how that goes. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Spain, and Switzerland do have some allowances for this already. And some countries like Belgium, I think perhaps just Belgium, I'm not sure, allow children with severe illnesses to receive assistance in dying, but that is not on the table here. So fears about abuse abound. Family members may pressure sick members, especially the elderly, to ask for MAID to become less of a burden. The argument that having MAID will mean that institutions and the government will put fewer resources toward palliative care and finding cures is also a common argument. And there are many other arguments about, against MAID out there. And I believe they all deserve careful consideration because each one does raise a legitimate concern. But what I know is that Bill C-7 is a cautious law, and it has many built-in safeguards to protect against abuse. I'm proud that Ron took advantage of it, and I'm really proud that Canada has this law. If it didn't, I don't like to think where Ron would be now, in some hellish limbo, and my family would have to stand by and witness his hell helplessly. Actually, he had already decided that he would find a way to end his lone life if he hadn't been approved for MAID. He had researched Dignitas in Zurich, which is an expensive option. And after his death, we found a substantial cache of opioids. And I think their purpose was obvious. But I'm extremely grateful he didn't need to kill himself. That would have been far more traumatic for our family. As it was, his death was very peaceful, hard, but peaceful, and totally legal. I am grateful. Thank you. Thank you all so much. You're very kind. We have a little clip of Ron's interview, taped interview that he did for Dying with Dignity Canada, which, by the way, is a wonderful organization. And it's just under 5 minutes long, but I thought it would really be nice to give him the last word and hear, some of his experience from his own mouth. He was always telling me I talk too much and to let him speak. So there you go.
I value my family, my friends, my existence very highly. But at a certain point, when you lose most of that, it's really more of a struggle for existence than a life of any kind of satisfaction or enjoyment. You'd like to have the option. I was a college English teacher for over 20 years. I guess around 2015, due to the increasingly severe pain levels and other degeneration, I had to stop working, went on disability leave, and then when it was clear that nothing was going to be improving, went into a sort of combination of disability and retirement. I've got a beautiful wife, 3 wonderful daughters, 3 very wonderful grandchildren, and I had some wonderful travels and great friends, all of which, yes, tends to sort of have to fall away when you're dealing with ever-increasing levels of pain and degeneration. And your life starts to just become significantly less possible because of that imprisonment. It sort of ends up being sort of a little bubble of existence you end up in. Of course, I see family and some friends, but you really don't feel connected in the way that you did before. It's sort of a disappearing act. You just end up stuck in this black hole of the chronic pain prison, having experienced the chronic pain and being aware of the evolution of the medically assisted dying legislation. I thought, yeah, well, it's possible that by sometime in the near future, I might actually be able to get a evaluation. So, first thing I did was talk to my GP. Initially said, yes, I would be willing to put through a request for an evaluation for you. But before he did that, he would like me to talk to my specialist. So I did talk to all 3 specialists over the next 3 or 4 months. All of which, frankly, just said, no, I'm not wanting to engage in that in any way. But at some point, I think they need to see things from the perspective of those who are not perfectly healthy. And so, yeah, I really felt like the doctors, as much as I understood their position, didn't really see just the reality of what it is to live with the pain that I'm living with day in and day out, other degeneration problems. And eventually it was just after many months of waiting and then working with the local health authority, I was able to get a MAID request done. I highly value the option of being able to say, yeah, no, I mean, I could go on for another 6 months, I could go on for another year, maybe. But, the last year or 2 years have been more than enough of a struggle. There's really only so much struggle one really wants to have to deal with. At a certain point, you just get very tired.
Well, and I guess now we take questions.
Perhaps I can start with questions from our
There was a gentleman.
viewing
There was a
audience.
gentleman there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I didn't hear what the Sisters of Grief, how you got in contact with them. Can you?
It's an organization called Bridge, literally Bridge C14, but because Bill C14 was the original MAID law. So Bridge C14. It's an online organization. So everything's done over Zoom. And like I said, they have myriad of different sort of group sessions that you can join. For one-on-one support is more through another organization, MAID Family Services. This is more geared towards, speaking in a group with other people they try to match you, like they have specific groups like for wives who are facing their husband's death, for husbands facing wives. They have specific ones like for children facing a parent's death. They're very tailored. And it's a wonderful service. It's all run by volunteers. They just take donation. Yeah, no problem.
Lori, would you repeat the question from the floor? In case
Oh,
people
sure,
don't-
yeah. So this gentleman asked what the name of the organization was where I met my grief sisters. Yeah,
I'm wondering what literary and philosophical resources to draw on as he got closer to his death. What supported him beyond obviously the love of his family?
well, what supported Ron as he got closer to death, given that he was a college English teacher? Well, reading was one thing that he could still do right to the end, thank goodness, although his concentration was somewhat faulty. He'd had some religion in his upbringing. He was raised Catholic, but he wasn't a churchgoer or anything, but he had his own, like he believed that we would all meet again somewhere in a kind of afterlife. I don't think it was a religious afterlife per se, but how his career as a college English teacher informed I find that a tough question to answer. He read widely, and he was very well informed on MAID and, and on all the medical ins and outs of his diseases and what kind of cures, he might try and all that. And I think towards the end, he was not reading as much as he did in his earlier days, just for lack of ability to concentrate. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but yeah. Yeah, was he able to die at home? Yeah, you can choose. You have the choice. That was one thing. The first doctor who came to do the assessment, we talked about that then and there, where Ron would like to die. And Ron it was an odd thing. He was never hospitalized for his disease. He was in every other way. I don't want to use the word healthy, but he functioned. If you're already in a palliative care place, you could have MAID there. He was told that if he wanted to die, if he didn't want to die at home, room could be made for him at a hospice or in a hospital, but that just seemed like, why would he? He died at home. And, and it was so much more personal. But of course, that's not an option for everybody. The doctor said some people don't want to die at home because then people have to go on living in that home sometimes, and they don't want that association. But in our case, it was so strange. We were in the two different apartments, and I knew that, I had after he was gone, I'd have no emotional attachment really to that place. So it was an easy decision to make. So it is kind of nice that you can opt to do it at home. I have a feeling most people opt to do it at home if they can, if they're well enough to be at home. Yeah.
Does track 2 allow healthy people to make their wishes known should they become unhealthy? And if it doesn't, is there any discussion about opening it up to that?
Yeah, there's no advanced consent for MAID, either track 1 or track 2. You can't decide, like I'm in my mid-60s, I can't decide today, well, in 20 years, if I'm really sick, I would like to have MAID. There's no advanced consent. There is, however, for track 1 people, if you're terminally ill, there's a possibility to sign a waive of consent. It's a different thing. So that on the day, you don't have to give consent. but that right now is only for track 1 people, so it's limited. There's a petition that if you're all interested in signing, through Dying with Dignity Canada, through their website, there's a link to the petition that's currently before Parliament to include in any future laws or revisions to the law to include advance consent. That's something that's very important, I think, to a lot of people. Yeah.
Can I just ask, sort of connected, does a, what do they call it now? Personal directive saying, you know, I don't want to end up in a nursing home. I don't want this. I don't want that. Does that, would that carry, or does it carry any weight?
I don't think so, because it's not included in Bill C7 or Bill C, well, I guess Bill C7 has supplanted Bill C14, not really sure. There's nothing in the law that allows for giving advance consent. So I don't know what's in the personal planning kits. I know that they're popular. I don't think you can say in there, I would like to have MAID if, and that would carry any legal weight. It's not part of the law.
We have one question, I believe, here from an audience member in the Zoom land. John Stewart, a colleague of ours, has indicated first, I'll just read this because he wrote it to you, I think.
Okay.
I extend our heartfelt appreciation for your heartfelt testament of your family's close course through MAID and beyond. One must hope that the healthcare providers can support more fully in future, given the experience of you and other families. Thank you for your sensitive presentation. His question is, with the advantage of hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Well, probably many things. When you're in that situation, you're kind of in a box and you're just dealing with, you know, what's immediately in front of you. So as I said in my talk, I wasn't as informed about, like I wasn't expecting the big black briefcase that he bought. It looked like a toolkit, you know, those, and the vials were huge. So that we kind of all we all kind of gasped. So I maybe would have liked to have been a little bit more informed. I knew the types of drugs that would be given, but I didn't know as much about the procedure as maybe I should have. There's always a few things that you wish you had said, you know, to the person that maybe never got said, but I don't really see how we could have done much differently, given we really weren't offered any resources where we were. We had no follow-up, no contact from this MAID coordinator that was eventually hired at our local CIU SSS. We never heard from her again. And we were the type of family that just kind of closed ranks and sort of relied on each other. But I do think, you know, it would be nice to think that there might be a MAID contact person assigned to each family to check in, especially I was so focused on the girls and making sure they were okay, because I knew they were losing their dad, you know, and I was focused on the grandchildren, making sure they were okay. So it might have been nice to have somebody that would check in with us, that maybe the kids could have talked to, that maybe, you know, that the girls could have asked questions to. But that's not something we could have done differently. That would require a change in the system.
And a comment from Jessica Karen, as opposed to a question, and wants to thank you so much for sharing your story and taking us through your journey.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
All right, thank you. They don't. Well, Laurie, I don't think I need to say anything at all. I think we are very, very grateful to you today for doing this. It was an amazing talk. And I think everybody here agrees that it was really moving and wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And just before you leave, I would like to say a huge thank you to our tech crew, to Bill and Bob and Colleen. And to Janet and Keith, who provided us with the coffee and tea and cookies. That was lovely. I think we all needed that. SCANS is a volunteer organization. We're always struggling for money, so please do join SCANS if you aren't already. If you've got any free time at all, we're always desperate for volunteers. And please check the website for the next lecture, which is coming up in February, which is on Sherlock Holmes. A little lighter.
Now for something completely different.
That was intentional. And of course, for the courses are starting soon, and we have wonderful courses on volcanoes and chakras and Shakespeare, you know, the whole gamut. So please do that. And thank you again, everybody, for coming, and thank you to those at home.